She hit the gate with her shoulder because her hands had stopped working right somewhere around the second mile. Stone. Cold iron. The gate did not move. Maren pressed her face to it and breathed through her nose and tried not to make a sound. Behind her, the road through the forest was dark in both directions. Nothing chased her now. Nothing had to. Her father had sold her in the afternoon, and by nightfall she had nowhere left on earth to go. She'd taken the road north because it was the only one she hadn't tried to die on yet. The wound on her arm had gone tight and hot. She'd wrapped it in the hem of her shirt somewhere around mile 1 when she'd stopped shaking enough to tie a knot. It wasn't deep. She'd had worse. That wasn't the point. The point was that it bled, and the blood had dried in a line down the inside of her elbow. And she kept thinking about how her father would have made her clean that up herself. She slid down the iron gate until she was sitting on wet gravel and decided she was done walking. The gate opened. Not because she touched it, not because anyone came. The latch disengaged with a sound like a single note struck on something old, and both halves swung inward, slow and deliberate, and the gravel path on the other side ran straight toward a house that was not a house. It was too large for that word, too stone dark, too quiet. Windows lit amber from within like eyes that had been watching the road for centuries. Maren did not move. A man appeared at the top of the path. He hadn't walked there. He was simply not there. And then he was, standing very still in the dark between 2 iron lampposts. And the light caught him from below, all jaw and shadow and old clothing that fit him the way armor fits someone who stopped worrying about war a long time ago. He looked down at her. She waited for him to say something. He didn't. He looked at her the way you'd look at something you hadn't expected to find whole. "I'm not," she started, and her voice came out wrong, too thin, and she stopped. He turned and walked back toward the house. Partway up the path, he paused, not looking back. He didn't say come. He didn't say anything. He simply paused. Maren got up. She told herself it was because staying on the wet gravel was worse. She told herself that as she followed him up the path, and she was still telling herself that when the door closed behind her and she stood in an entrance hall that smelled of old stone and smoke and something she couldn't name. Old, older than fire, older than the stone itself. And the warmth of the place hit her so unexpectedly that her legs went wrong. She caught herself on a side table. He was already at the far end of the hall, speaking in a low voice to a woman who appeared from a doorway. Small, gray-haired, a long, dark apron, a face that had learned not to show surprise. He didn't look back at Maren. The woman looked at her, nodded once, and disappeared again. He turned then. "You're injured," he said. Not a question. His voice was low and precise, as if each word cost something specific, and he had decided the expense was acceptable. Maren looked at her arm. "It's fine." He regarded her for a moment. "You will be seen to." He turned and walked through a door to the left, and it closed behind him without a sound. And she was left alone in the hall with the warmth pressing in from all sides, and the distant sound of the house doing whatever large old houses do at night. And nothing chasing her. Nothing at all. The gray-haired woman reappeared. "Come," she said, and her voice was kind in the way of someone who had decided kindness was practical. "There's a room prepared." Maren followed her up a staircase that could have swallowed her childhood house whole. The room had a fire. It had a bed with actual sheets. It had a window that showed nothing but dark forest, and she stood at it for a long time, trying to calculate which direction her father's village was in, and what he would do when he found out she'd run, and whether it mattered, and decided it did not matter. Not tonight, not with the fire this warm. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her dirty clothes, and waited for someone to come and tell her what this would cost. No one came. She woke in the morning, and for 4 full seconds, she did not know where she was. And then she knew. And then she waited for the thing that would make sense of it. The catch. The ledger. She'd learned young that care had one. Nothing happened. The fire was banked low, but still warm. The window was morning gray. On the small table by the door, there was a tray, bread, something in a covered bowl, a cup of tea still faintly steaming. And she stood in the middle of the room and looked at it for a long time before she crossed the floor and sat down. She ate fast, out of habit. The woman's name was Petra. She appeared after Maren had finished eating, knocked lightly, asked if she'd like the dressing on her arm changed. Maren said yes before she could think of a reason to say no, and sat still while Petra worked. Clean cloth, something that stung, then cool linen, all without commentary or questions about how it had happened. "What is this place?" Maren asked. "His estate," Petra said, as though that answered everything. "And him." Petra tied off the bandage. "His name is Alexei." A pause. "He doesn't explain himself. I'd save yourself the trouble of asking." Maren looked at the window. "What does he want with me?" Petra was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," she said, and said it with such complete, ordinary confidence that Maren almost believed her. She spent the first day mapping the estate in her head and the way she'd mapped every place she'd ever had to leave. Exits, sight lines, places a person could not be cornered. It was a large project. The house was enormous, the grounds larger. There was a gate on the east side that was not locked from the inside. There were horses in a stable that looked well kept. There were, she was nearly certain, things in this castle that she was not going to understand, and that she had decided not to think about yet. She saw Alexei once at the far end of a corridor. He was reading something. He looked up when she passed, and she kept walking. And when she glanced back, he had returned to the page. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something that felt more like a trap. The second day, she found the kitchen and ate breakfast at the staff's table because the dining room felt absurd for one person. And Petra raised no objection. And the cook, a man who introduced himself as Orlik and appeared to take deep personal satisfaction in feeding people, made her eggs and put them in front of her like she was owed them. Maren ate them slowly, this time. She was still waiting for the catch. She had stopped pretending otherwise. Alexei found her in the library on the third afternoon. She hadn't been looking for him. She'd been looking for something to read. Not because she was comfortable, not because this had become anything, but because the window in the library had a seat built into the stone, and from it she could see 3 exits and the stable. And it was the most defensible reading position she'd found so far. She heard the door and looked up from the book she'd taken from the shelf without reading the spine. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her, and then at the book, and then at the window, and she watched him notice the sight lines without saying anything about them. He came in without asking, and went to a far section of shelves, and took down something heavy, and sat at the long table across the room, and opened it and read. That was all. She looked back at her book. She read the same page 3 times. She noticed that the fire in here was burning higher than it had been that morning, and that someone had added wood to it recently, and that Alexei had been in this room before she got here. She turned a page she hadn't read. The fire settled. Outside the window, snow had started to fall. She watched it collect on the stone ledge and tried to remember the last time she'd been warm 3 days in a row. She couldn't. "What do you want from me?" she said, without planning to say it. The words came out flat, as if she'd practiced them, which she hadn't. She'd been trying very hard not to think the question at all. He looked up from his book. His face was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it was old, not in years, but in the way of something that had learned to keep its surface still. "Nothing," he said. It was the same word Petra had used. It landed differently from him. She looked at him for a moment. People don't take in strangers for nothing. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than most people managed. "I don't require you to believe me," he said. "I require nothing of you at all." He returned to his book. Maren looked at the snow on the ledge. There was a crack in the stone along the inner sill, old, mineral dark, with a thin line of old mortar crumbled into it. She counted the length of it with her eyes, counted it again. She did not say anything else. She came back to the library the next morning, and he was already there, and neither of them said anything about it. And she sat in the window seat, and he sat at the table, and the fire burned between them. And that was how it became a thing they did. It was not comfort. She was not going to call it that. But she stopped sleeping with her boots on after the 4th night. And she noticed that she had, and she didn't put them back on. On the 6th morning, she found him in the corridor outside her room. She opened the door, and he was there, which almost made her step backward. And then she saw that he was talking to one of the guards, a man she'd noticed stationed near the east wing. And his voice was low and final, and the guard was nodding, and Alexei's eyes had a quality she'd seen once before in a man who was choosing very carefully not to do something. The guard left. Alexei turned to her. He looked at her arm. "Better?" he said. She flexed her hand. "Yes." He nodded once. He turned to leave, and she said, before she decided to, "My father sent men to look for me." She didn't know why she said it. She hadn't meant to give him anything. Alexei stilled. "How many?" "I don't know. He'd want to get his property back." The word came out of her voice like a thing she'd said 100 times. Which she had. Which was the point. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted the way stone shifts after deep frost, not visibly, but she felt it. "They will not find you," he said. She waited for him to say more. He didn't. He walked away down the corridor, and she watched him go. And later she discovered that the guard at the east gate had been tripled, and that the perimeter patrol ran through the night in shifts, and that Alexei had apparently done this the same evening she'd arrived, before she'd said anything at all. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it down like something too hot to hold and thought about it in small pieces from a distance. She was in the library when Petra came to find her on the 8th day. And Petra's face was the face of a woman who had decided that news delivered calmly was less frightening than news delivered any other way. And Maren put her book down before Petra said anything. "There are men at the gate," Petra said. "6 of them." Maren stood up. "Stay here," Petra said. And it came out gentle, which was not a thing Petra usually deployed. "He's gone." Maren went to the window. The library didn't face the gate. She went to the door, and Petra did not stop her, only walked beside her, down the corridor, to a window on the north side that showed the outer approach. 6 men, horses, her father's colors, rust and brown, colors she associated with the particular quality of his anger. The man in front was one she recognized. Broad and patient, her father's chief of men, the one he sent when he wanted the message delivered clearly. Alexei stood between them and the gate. He was alone. He had not brought guards. He stood in the snow with his hands at his sides, and she could not hear what was being said. The distance was too far, but she could see the man in front gesturing, and she could see Alexei not moving. Then Alexei said something. One sentence. She couldn't hear it. The man in front went very still. Then his horse stepped backward, not because he pulled the reins. The horse had decided on its own, with the particular intelligence of an animal that understands something its rider doesn't, that backward was the correct direction. 2 more horses followed, then all of them. Alexei stood in the snow and watched them go and did not move until they were out of sight. And then he turned and looked up at the window where she stood. And she flinched before she caught herself, not from fear or not only. And he held her gaze for a moment from that distance. And then he walked back inside. Her hands were pressed flat to the glass. She hadn't noticed until she looked at them. The stone was cold, and her breath was fogging the window. And she was counting the small bubbles in the old glass, 1, 2, 3, the way the glassmaker had trapped air 100 years ago. And she counted them twice and was starting a third time when she heard the door at the end of the corridor and his footsteps. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at her hands on the glass. "They won't come back," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't ask what he'd said. She didn't ask about the horses. "He sold me," she said. It wasn't information. She hadn't been trying to say anything. For a barrel of wine and a horse. Alexei said nothing. "I've been trying to figure out," she said, "whether that's worse than if he'd needed the money." She had not said this out loud before. She hadn't meant to say it now. She looked at the floor. "It is worse," Alexei said. His voice was quiet and certain, and he said it as if it mattered to him that she know it, as if he wanted no ambiguity in the record on that point. She didn't say anything. "The fire is lit in the east sitting room," he said a moment later. "If you want to sit somewhere that isn't a corridor." She turned around and looked at him. He looked back, still waiting. She went to the sitting room. He followed, not close, a few feet behind, and she sat in the chair nearest the fire, and he sat in the other one, across from her. And neither of them said anything for a long time. The fire burned. Outside, she knew, the snow was covering her father's men's tracks. That was fine. She didn't need to see them to know they were gone. She didn't sleep well that night, which was expected. What wasn't expected was that it wasn't fear that kept her up. She lay in the dark and watched the firelight on the ceiling and thought about the way Alexei had stood in the snow, alone, and the way the horses had decided. She thought about the fact that he had known about her father's men before she told him, that the guard had been tripled before she said anything, that the fire in the east sitting room had been lit before he'd offered it. She had spent her whole life watching for the angle. Everyone had one, even the people who pretended not to. She thought about it from every direction she knew and came up with nothing. The fire in the grate burned low. She watched it. He had said nothing. He required nothing. She had not believed a person could mean that. She was not entirely sure she believed it now, but she was certain, by some mechanism she didn't have words for, that if there was a ledger, it wasn't one she'd been given to carry. That was the only thought she'd ever had about a place she was in that felt like that. And she recognized it as something important and put it down carefully and went to sleep. She went to the library in the morning, and he was there. She sat down in the window seat without saying anything. He turned a page without looking up. The snow outside was deep and still. After a while, she said, "The library in my father's house had 2 books, a ledger and a Bible. He'd written in the Bible." She didn't say what. She didn't have to. Alexei did not look up. He did not offer anything in response, no condolence, no performance of sympathy. He simply listened, and when she stopped, the room held the things she'd said, and that was all. And it was enough. She hadn't known until that moment that enough was a thing she was looking for. On the 10th day, she woke to shouting. She was dressed and at the window in the time it took her heart to beat twice. Below, in the courtyard, there were figures, not her father's men, different, darker clothing, and more of them. And they had come from the south wall, which meant they'd come over it, which meant they'd come prepared. She counted. 8, maybe 10. Hard to tell. Alexei was already in the courtyard. He had not come from inside. He was simply there, the way he'd been simply at the top of the path that first night. And the men saw him, and the one in front raised a hand that held a weapon she couldn't name at this distance. What happened next, she didn't have the words for afterward. She'd tried. What she could say, it was fast, faster than anything she'd seen a person do. What she could say, no one who had come over that wall left the courtyard standing. What she could say, when it was over, he stood in the center and he was not breathing hard, and he turned and looked up at the window where she was watching, and his face was the same as it always was. Her father had sent men who hurt people for money. She'd grown up knowing what that looked like. What this looked like was different. This was old and absolute, the way weather was absolute, and it had happened in under a minute. And it had happened because something had come into his house to get her. She sat on the edge of the bed afterward and put her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the wall opposite. There was a painting there. A winter landscape, dark trees, pale sky. Something that might have been a figure at the edge of the trees. She looked at it for a while. She noticed that the frame had a small chip of paint missing from the lower right corner, and that the wood underneath was pale where the gilt had gone. She looked at that pale spot for a long time. When Petra came to check on her, Maren said, "Has he always been like that?" Petra set a cup on the table. "Yes," she said, "for as long as I've known him." A pause. "He doesn't use it carelessly." Maren looked at the cup. She hadn't touched it. "No," she said. "I know." She did know. That was the strange thing. She knew, from 8 days of watching, that the thing he'd shown her tonight was not something he pointed at people without reason, and that it had never, not once, come close to pointing at her, and that she had always been on the side of it that was safe. She'd thought sometimes, coming through his hallways, past his guards, that she was afraid of him. She'd tested the feeling like a bruise, poked it, waited for pain. It had never been quite right. Not afraid, not exactly. It was more like the thing you feel standing at the edge of something vast. Not fear of it, awareness of its size. Alexei knocked once, that evening, and stood in the doorway. "Your father's village?" he said. She looked at him. "He will not trade another woman for wine," Alexei said. The words were flat, final, not a promise. Promises were offered forward into time. This was a statement of something that had already been decided. "The village is ash." Maren looked at the winter landscape on the wall for a moment. "The other people there?" she said. "The ones who weren't him." "Safe," Alexei said. "Relocated before." She looked at him. He stood in the doorway, and his face was the same as it always was. And she understood, in a way she hadn't the night she arrived, that his face was never going to tell her anything that his actions hadn't already said first. She had grown up in a village that had never been safe for her. She had slept with one eye open in her own bed for 20 years. She had never, not in all of that, had anyone do what had just been described quietly in a doorway, as a piece of information being passed from one person to another. She said, "Thank you." He nodded once and left. She did not cry. She sat with it, the way she sat with things that were too large to move. Carefully, from a distance, with respect for the size. The fire burned. Outside, the snow was deep. In the morning, she went downstairs and found Alexei in the entrance hall, which was where he always was in the morning. Apparently, a habit she'd learned without meaning to. He was reading, standing up, which was something she'd noticed he did. He rarely sat, except in the library when she was there. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked up from the page. "I know I could," she said. "The East Gate, the horses, I know." A pause. "I'm not leaving." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, very brief, very old. The way a glacier moved, something that had been still for a very long time, making a small shift under pressure. He said, "I know." She looked at him. "Is there a difference," she said, "between knowing I could leave and choosing not to, and just staying?" "Yes," he said. He closed the book. "There is." His voice was quiet, and the word carried the weight of someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear a specific distinction made. She stayed. Petra brought wine that evening to the sitting room, and Alexei poured it and handed her a glass, and she took it. And they sat on opposite sides of the fire. And Orlik had made something with pastry, and it was good. And the fire was warm, and outside the snow had stopped. And Maren sat in the chair and drank her wine slowly and thought about the words she'd learned was enough. This, she thought, looking at the fire, at the room, at the man across from her who was reading again and not asking her for anything. This is a thing she hadn't known was possible. She hadn't been afraid. She understood that now, in the way that you understand something once the right distance opens up. Not since the first night. She had been watching for a trap, and instead she'd found something she didn't have a word for in the vocabulary of her life until now. She had a word for it now. He looked up from his reading, and she was already looking at him. And she didn't look away. Neither did he. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock marked the hour. The fire settled. She picked up her glass and said, "The library tomorrow?" "Yes," Alexei said. That was all. She finished her wine and went to bed, and the fire in her room was burning. And she slept straight through till morning without her boots on and without one eye open. And when she woke, the light was early and gray. And she lay in it and did not count the exits. There was no crown in the end. That wasn't how any of it worked. There was just the morning and the library and the seat by the window that had become hers and the fire that was always lit before she arrived. That was enough. It was more than enough. She stopped waiting for it to cost her something on the 14th day. And she knew it by the way she sat down at breakfast and didn't count the exits in the kitchen and noticed that she hadn't. And felt nothing about it except something that settled in her chest, like the end of a very long walk. He was in the corridor when she came out of the kitchen. He was talking to Orlik, who was arguing about something involving a delivery. And Alexei was listening with patient, precise attention. And he looked up and saw her. And she nodded. And he nodded. And she went to the library. He came 15 minutes later. She was in the window seat. The snow outside was old and crusted now, marked with the footprints of birds. He sat at the table and opened his book. She opened hers. The fire burned between them. She was not afraid. She had not been. Not since the first night. She was home.